unabashed,
the most unpredictable,
becomes a headline,
the most volatile,
outrageous behavior,
unsubstantiated narratives, a battle of personalities.
Welcome to Grant the Masha, a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindutva Times. I'm your host, Milan. On September 5th, 2017, the journalist Gauri Lankesh was shot and killed outside of her house in Bangalore by armed assailants traveling on a motorbike. Lankesh had a long and distinguished career as a journalist and a social activist. She was known for being a fierce critic of right-wing Hindutva policies, and her murder has widely been seen as retribution for her outspoken views. A new book by the journalist Rollo Romig, I Am on the Hit List, A Journalist's Murder and the Rise of Autocracy in India, recounts the extraordinary life and tragic death of Gauri Lankesh. Rollo is a journalist, essayist, and critic. He has been reporting on South India since 2013, most often for the New York Times Magazine. To talk more about his new book and his years reporting from South India, I'm pleased to welcome Rollo to the show for the very first time. Rollo, congrats on the book. It's been so fun to read you over the years. Thanks so much for taking the time.
Thank you so much. I'm just delighted to be here.
So I want to, before we get into Gauri's story, I want to get into your story a little bit. You start off the book by saying, just weeks before her murder took place, you were in Bangalore. It was one of many visits that you've made to the city. You were there in part because you and your family loved the place so much, you were thinking about moving there. And, readers who pick up this book, and I hope they do, I think will get the feeling that I got, which is that Bangalore is very much a character in this book, right? Alongside Gauri, her family, her friends, and so on. Tell us a little bit about your own personal love affair with Bangalore. Where and how did that begin?
Yeah, I definitely think of Bangalore as one of the main characters of the book. And it's really a city that I fell in love with. It's a city that really only came to prominence in recent decades as it's kind of exploded as this tech capital. It hardly ever even appeared on maps of India or on globes before in the past few decades. And it always had this distinct culture, but it had kind of the character of a much smaller city, of more like a town. And then it's just exploded in both significance and size. Its population just keeps doubling over and over again. And long-timers there are totally bewildered by how much it's changed, And there's a lot of complaining about how much it's changed. But to me, this kind of the various conflicting threads of Bangalore are what's so interesting about it to me. It still somehow has the character of a small town, and it still somehow retains so much of its old character. But it is this bustling mega city with everything that a mega city has to offer. So I love all those contrasts of the city. It's also, not incidentally, just got one of the best literary scenes of any city I've ever been to. Just an incredible booksellers row, completely inexhaustible. If you love book browsing, there's just no better place you could go. All on this one street called Church Street in central Bangalore. And so many great writers have ended up holing up there. And it's just sort of like the literary scene of my dreams. So we would go there. My wife is also a writer. She's from Kerala, the neighboring state to Karnataka that Bangalore is the capital of. And we just started looking for excuses to spend time in Bangalore. And we just before Gauri was murdered, we just finished spending a month there. And I'd heard of Gauri before, and I knew so many people who knew her. And I'd actually, it's funny, I first heard of her because I read about her in a book that I bought on Church Street, the memoir of this former mafia don in Bangalore, the top mafia don in Bangalore, who's kind of reinvented himself as a literary figure.
As one does.
As one does. And he's actually quite a good writer. He's a really fascinating guy. He's a character in the book too. And he writes about Gauri in his book because he knew her since she was a teenager. And so I'd read his book and knew about her from his story. And but that was most of the background that I had on her when she was murdered, which came as just this enormous shock, because one of the things that distinguishes Bangalore is it's a very easygoing place. Even as huge and chaotic as it's gotten, it's just known as being very mellow, accommodating, very low crime, and certainly gun crime it's almost unheard of. So just the fact of this woman, this middle-aged journalist, alone on her doorstep, coming home after a day's work and getting shot dead, just even the fact of that kind of crime happening was an incredible shock in Bangalore.
So we're going to come to the circumstances of her death in a second. Let me just kind of, talk to you about Bangalore for another minute.
Yeah.
You're not oblivious to some of the downsides of the city. You recount some of them in the book, not least the awful traffic. But you have this, very nice passage, and I just want to quote what you wrote. You said, "I'm describing a city I love, a city that I dream of living in. I never experienced the old, mourned, and for all I know, mythical Bangalore in its golden years. And honestly, the Bangalore I do know seems wonderful. Just as I loved the New York City I moved to in 2000, while old-timers assured me that it was already dead and gone." What a lovely passage. It would just reflect for a second on the comparison, New York City and Bangalore.
Yeah, and there's one of the weird things is that Bangalore is actually a much bigger city than New York City in terms of population, and yet it feels smaller in so many ways because it's retained a bit of this kind of town character. It's kind of the paradox of the place. New York City is, can feel like the center of the world. It insists on itself as the center of the world. I live in New York City. I resist that categorization because I don't think there is a center of the world. But yeah, I've thought about that a lot, about what makes these two cities that I'm most interested in distinct. And yeah, I have a hard time getting my head around the fact that Bangalore is actually the bigger city. But yeah, the traffic is absolutely insane. It's one of these things that it's hard to find a different topic of conversation just because it interrupts everything. It's literally the worst traffic in the world. People who study traffic say that no city has worse gridlock than Bangalore. And yeah, it was a place where, like, not that long ago, the streets were virtually empty and people were bicycling everywhere. So it's
I remember going, I guess it probably was 2017 or 2018. And I was there for a really short visit, like 2 nights or something. I was staying in a hotel, and I remember before going to bed asking the guy at the front desk, how early should I book a taxi to go to the airport? And he was like, "Well, it could take you 45 minutes or 4.5 hours. So you should probably go 4.5 hours early." I was like, "Okay, well, I'm glad I asked. That's quite a range."
Exactly. Yeah. And you really don't know. You have no idea which one you're going to get. And yeah, you really have to like plan your expeditions way in advance in a way that seems very like un-Indian. Whereas usually social engagements in India are a lot more spontaneous and off the cuff, which I love. In Bangalore, you just got to plan ahead.
Right. I want to, we've already kind of, talked about Gauri. So let's kind of get back in sequence here. Tell us a little bit about her, about her career, who she was as a person. At one point in the book, you note when you're describing the tributes to her that many of the same adjectives tended to recur in people's recollections. You write, she was fun-loving, they wrote, free-spirited, fair-minded, impatient, impulsive, affectionate, humane, exasperating, anxious about injustice, disputatious to a fault, quick to laughter, quick to anger, quick to make friends. The word feisty appeared with great frequency, but so did the word frail. Really evocative description. Just tell us a little bit about who she was.
Yeah, she was a phenomenon. She was a rare person, who she's the kind of person who everyone remembers when they meet her, and I regret so much that I never had the chance to meet her. And it's such a privilege, but an odd privilege, to write about a person like this who you never met and spend so much time getting to know them after their death through the people who knew them best. But everyone I spoke to who knew her had lots to say about her because she was just this force of nature, and also people just loved her, even when they were exasperated with her, and they often were because she could be enormously exasperating. People just loved having her in their lives. She was just this source of life and energy and passion and fun. Um, and, it's interesting because she was a journalist. That was her profession. And she was a journalist her whole adult life. She had her early journalism career was kind of a more conventional journalism career, kind of more like mine, of just writing for magazines and editing and, mainstream publications and approaching journalism in kind of the conventional way. And then there was this enormous shift that happened for her in the year 2000 when her father died. And her father was just this absolute giant of Kannada literature. Kannada is the primary language of Karnataka, the state where she lived. And it's just difficult to overstate his impact on the writing scene there. He wrote in every medium imaginable, short stories, plays, poems, but he made his biggest impact as the editor and one of the primary authors of this tabloid newspaper called Lankesh Patrike. And it was a tabloid in format, but also in style. It was this, people described it as this incredible mix of high-minded literary material and just like low gutter gossip. And just bringing the two together in this incredibly dynamic and exciting way. People just couldn't wait to read another issue. And so he had just had a huge impact culturally, politically, so many ways with this newspaper. And when he died, she took the paper over as editor, which was kind of crazy because she actually was not fluent in Kannada when she took over the paper, and that's the paper's language. She was only fluent in English. She'd learned some Kannada growing up, but she'd actually failed her Kannada exams twice. So it was, no one expected that she'd be taking over that paper, least of all her. But she just it was just this incredible pivot point in her life. And she took over this paper and really, quickly learned Kannada, at least well enough to write for and edit the paper. And, but then also became really immersed in kind of the local, on the ground problems and culture of her state, Because when you're writing in English, especially in India, English is an Indian language, and Indians use it in their own very specific way. But it's kind of like this, you only get a bird's eye view of what's going on with English, And when you are writing in a non-English language in India, that's when you get really engaged in what's actually happening specifically on the ground. That's what happened to her, and it just transformed her. And she really kind of pivoted towards being more of an activist, actually, over time. She started calling herself a journalist activist with a hyphen. And then by the end of her life, she'd actually flipped that. She described herself as an activist journalist. So, when she was killed, she wasn't really known outside the state. And I think outsiders, including Indians who were outside of Karnataka, assumed that she was like this major journalist in Karnataka. And by extension that she was killed for her journalism. She actually wasn't that major of a journalist. Her newspaper was really struggling by the time she died, for all the reasons that newspapers are struggling everywhere. And there was talk that the paper probably wouldn't even survive much longer after she was killed. She wasn't this national figure, but there was this incredible outpouring when she died. As I said, partly it was the shock of it, but partly it was because it was her. And what I found was behind that outpouring was that she had connected with so many people all across the state, across India too, but especially in her state, like she had this talent for making connections that went far beyond even what people who knew her realized. They only really understood it when tens of thousands of people came out on the street, all of whom felt close to her, and people from every community in Karnataka who you could imagine. Muslims, Christians, transgender people, student activists. I mean, you name it. And, you know, that to me was what kind of emerged to me as her true talent, was this talent for connection, this talent for friendship, this talent really for building community. And it's the kind of thing that actually doesn't come with a salary. It sure didn't for her. She was completely broke when she died. And it doesn't often come with a lot of credit. It's the kind of thing that's often dismissed as kind of like women's work, this community building work. But is deeply political, what she was doing with community. And it had just an enormous impact on countless people. And it's the kind of work where you only really notice how far-reaching the work is when the person doing it is gone. And that's exactly what happened in this case. That suddenly this gulf revealed itself, this space that she'd been filling that was now a void.
This is George Perkovich. For 3 decades, the Carnegie Nuclear Policy Conference has helped government officials, journalists, NGOs, industry, scholars, and students to debate and understand the latest risks and possible pathways to managing them. This year's conference will be held on April 21 and 22. Registration is open, but seating is limited. For more information on the program and to register, go to carnegieendowment.org/NPC2025.
We said a few words at the beginning about her murder, but she was there was assailants who were kind of waiting for her as she approached her doorstep. She was, coming home from the office, shot and killed her on the path to her home. A few months after that terrible incident, you went away. You came back to Bangalore, and you started to try to unravel the mystery of her death, and as you call it, her afterlife. And you hadn't met her before, as you said. Was there something specifically that resonated with you? Because one gets the feeling when you kind of read this book, although you don't necessarily say it explicitly, it's just like you had something stuck in your craw, right? And you kind of had to expunge it.
Yeah, obviously there was the mystery of who murdered her and why. It was a mystery to everybody. It was totally baffling. There were so many different theories at first about who killed her. And so there's that whodunit part. But for me, actually, what really kept me going for the years it took to write this book was just kind of the mystery of her life, of who she was, why she chose to live the way she did. And I guess just the question of how to live a life, I felt like I learned an incredible amount from studying this extraordinary person's life about how to live a life. Questions that I'm grappling with in my own middle age, about how to cultivate and maintain friendships, about the proper role of politics in one's work and in one's life. Just to, how should I be spending my time? Who should I be spending my time with? What should I care about? These are the mysteries that engage me even more than the whodunit of who killed her. And to me, that's actually what the book is really about.
You talk at some length in the book about these various theories that were out there. When you left Bangalore after your first trip following her death, you note that, nearly everyone you talked to was resigned to the inevitability that Gauri's killing would be just another unsolved murder, right? That it would be kind of a cold case that would just be kind of put in the deep freeze. when you returned back to Bangalore, I think it was 6 months later, you say a lot had changed. What kind of happened in the interim? What was the status of this special investigative team that was set up, and what did they start to find? What did they start to piece together?
Yeah, so people had very good reason to be cynical about where the case would be going, because actually Gauri's murder was the fourth murder in a series of murders that all seemed to fit the same modus operandi of older writers shot dead on their doorstep, with the same caliber gun in each case by two assailants on a motorcycle. So there seemed to be a very clear pattern here. And
And I just want to point out, just sorry to interrupt, these four other activists, whose deaths were also covered by the media. They were the doctor and activist Narendra Dabholkar, the lawyer, communist organizer Govind Pansare, and the scholar M.M. Kalburgi, right? And so Gauri was immediately kind of put into the same category as these other three, and people started referring to them as kind of, targeted hits on quote unquote rationalists.
Exactly, because, so rationalist in the Indian context means it's roughly equivalent to atheist. It has some different connotations. They were often described as these four rationalist writers, maybe not totally accurately, because Kalburgi, I don't think he was an atheist, but they all kind of fit in this progressive tradition. And yeah, the three previous murders of these three men who were killed before her in the same pattern, those investigations had gone nowhere. The first one, Narendra Dabholkar, had happened 4 years before Gauri's murder. And yeah, that case was a complete disaster. So, the chief investigator of that case actually brought in a spirit medium to try to help find the culprit. The spirit medium was actually a former cop who'd quit the force and reinvented himself as some kind of clairvoyant. And he claimed that he could access Dabholkar's soul, and that Dabholkar himself would come back from the grave and reveal to them who his killer was.
Oh my goodness!
Yeah,
this is the part of Law and Order that always gets left out, apparently.
I guess so. Yeah, and so they thought this was a fine idea. They even invited a magazine journalist to watch one of these seances that they conducted. So obviously, this did not produce much actionable intelligence, and really wasted a lot of police resources while the real evidence went cold. So this was kind of the pattern. But all three of the cases, they really just seemed to be going nowhere. And Gauri's case at first also seemed to be going nowhere too. The Home Minister of Karnataka kept promising that, oh yeah, we were just about to crack the case. It's right around the corner. We'll be making an announcement very soon. And then silence. And so everyone very reasonably assumed this is going nowhere. What was actually happening was that the reason that the actual investigators were quiet is because they were smart. They were actually finding a lot out, but they weren't going to the press about it. They were trying to stay discreet about what they were finding, and they only went public with it once they felt like they'd really cracked the case. And then they started making a lot of arrests in quick succession. So they ended up charging 18 men for conspiring to kill Gauri and arrested 17 of them. One of them is still on the run to this day. So that was most of those arrests happened in 2018, the year after Gauri was killed. And then, a number of these men were implicated also in the murders of the three writers who preceded her.
And, the group that was, closely linked to her killing is, a kind of shadowy organization called Sanatan Sanstha, which translates literally as the eternal organization. I suspect this is not a group that many of our listeners would have heard of. It is a right-wing Hindu organization, but it's not a formal part of the kind of BJP, RSS family of organizations. How would you describe Sanatan Sanstha's role? What is its place in this kind of broader right-wing ecosystem?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. They are, you could describe them as a fringe group. They often have been described as a fringe group. They've got these kind of cult-like qualities. I'm not enough of an expert on a cult. I'm not enough of an expert on cults to know if they qualify, but their neighbors of their ashram in Goa often describe them and their members as cult-like, that they seem to be just kind of hypnotized by the group's activities. And actually the guru of the organization is a trained hypnotist. He abandoned a career as a clinical hypnotherapist before he became the guru of this group. And a lot of classic cult behavior where people join their ashram and are ordered to cut their families off, this kind of stuff, give all their assets to the organization, this sort of stuff. And there's always been this kind of trail of violence that's followed them, of their members being implicated or accused, often in straight up terrorist activities, bombings of movie theaters, and of festivals, this sort of thing. Somehow the organization itself, Sanatan Sanstha, seems to never get touched, and the guru never seems to get touched. He hasn't even appeared publicly in decades. They say he's in ill health, and he confines himself strictly to the ashram. No one's seen him in 20 years, at least publicly. And but it's, so they're called a fringe group, but their politics and their objectives align pretty closely with that of the ruling party of India currently, the BJP. So are they fringe? I mean, they're fringe in some ways, but are their attitudes or their political beliefs fringe? No, they're actually the mainstream. They're extreme, but I don't know if it's accurate to call them fringe. And we see the same phenomenon happening here in the United States, that there are, absolutely extreme right-wing attitudes and right-wing groups that are both extreme and mainstream. Yeah. So I would put them in that category.
And look, we know from her writings, and you describe this very well in the book, that Gauri was a fierce advocate of liberal values. She was a major critic of Hindu nationalism. But, her primary cause, as you note, was really about mounting a local defense of Indian pluralism in her home state, right, in Karnataka. So help us kind of connect the dots, right? I mean, what was the nature of the connection between these four individuals, the shadowy organization, and how did she get onto this, this so-called hit list?
That's right. Her central cause, her biggest passion, was what's often called in the Indian context communal harmony, which usually refers specifically to harmony and coexistence among religious groups, which in many places happens quite naturally. There are actually a lot of beautifully and fascinatingly shared traditions among religious groups. We hear a lot about, for good reason, religious conflict in India, but there are so many shared traditions. There are so many sites that are shared by both Hindu and Muslim worshippers, for example, and even combined traditions in many cases. And maybe in Karnataka more than anywhere else, these kind of sites that are shared by multiple religious traditions. It's really a fascinating and lovely thing. And the Hindutva right wing is adamantly opposed to this. And they've mounted some very focused campaigns on trying to disrupt the shared aspect of these sites and of these traditions, and to claim these sites as Hindu only. That's how Gauri really got on this activist track. There's this specific site in Karnataka, this mountaintop called Baba Budangiri, that has this really fascinating shrine that, it's half Hindu, half Muslim, and you see I went there myself to check the place out, and the first thing I saw was outside. It's actually a cave, and outside the cave, I saw a group of Muslim men smashing coconuts, which is a traditional Hindu temple activity, and it's so many examples like that on the site of these shared traditions, and for decades now, one of these Hindu right-wing groups has been systematically trying to disrupt this place and turn it into a Hindu-only site. So she was invited up to this mountaintop by Girish Karnad, who is one of the biggest literary figures. So it's certainly one of the most prominent playwrights in contemporary India. He just died.
I mean, when you were describing the nature of Bangalore, I think, Girish Karnad, Ram Guha, there are a few people who are kind of in the pantheon, right?
Yeah. And I was really lucky to be able to meet with Girish Karnad before he died a couple of years ago. He was quite a character, and he was one of these people just incredibly accomplished in everything that he touched. He was both he was easily one of the biggest playwrights in India, but also a big movie star. He started he would be in big action blockbusters and stuff like that. And then he would mount his plays in Bangalore and many other things besides. So he was increasingly an activist as he got older. And he invited Gauri to this mountaintop to see what was going on there. And to try to mount a progressive response to this kind of hate campaign that was going on the mountaintop. And she was a little dismissive when he invited her. She was really focused on her journalism. She was already editing her father's newspaper, but she was like, "Oh, I'm too busy with the paper." And then at the last minute, she decided, "You know what? I'll come." Changed her life. So she had this epiphany on the mountaintop, and she really became an activist in that moment, and just really became a founding member of a communal harmony organization with other activists, and increasingly focused her paper's coverage on this stuff too.
Hey, Grant the Masha listeners. Thanks for listening to the podcast. Putting this show together each week is a labor of love, but it takes a lot of work to put out a great show every week. If you'd like to support the work we do at Grant the Masha, please visit ceip.org/donate. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or on your favorite podcasting platform, so you'll be the first to know when a new episode rolls out. So, Rollo, where does the case stand? I mean, who actually is serving time? Who pulled the trigger? I mean, what do we know actually about the fine details of, what happened that horrible evening?
We know a lot, or we seem to know a lot. The police put together this extraordinarily vast document of evidence called a charge sheet, which is that's the name of the document in the Indian justice system that police investigators assemble to make the case that someone should be charged. Their charge sheet in this case was over 9,000 pages long. And
just mind-boggling.
Yeah, and it's just this incredible wealth of information. It was wonderful for me. It includes hundreds of pages of statements by the accused, by these 17 men who they arrested, and just lays out the story of exactly what happened. Now, it's an interesting question, how much can be trusted in these police statements? Was any of it coerced? Was any of it fabricated? These things happen, by police everywhere, but, there's a particular history of it in Indian police. There's a history of torture by Indian police. I always had to think about that when reading these documents, how much can I actually trust what's written in here? But I felt that, having immersed myself in these statements, there was enough of a consistency in what was being said but not a repetition. Sometimes when police in India are sloppy about presenting fake confessions, they'll just copy paste. They'll just copy paste confessions across multiple accused people on one case, and it's really obvious that these are coerced statements. That was not the case here. The statements each of them felt original, and they all felt like they corroborated each other, and they all felt like they lined up with other publicly known information. So I felt like I have a high degree of trust in what's in these statements. And the picture they paint is of this conspiracy that actually went far beyond these 18 men, dozens of men who were trained to carry out bombings and assassinations, many of whom had not been activated yet, who were being held in reserve for future plots. And they had a long list, a hit list, that's where the title comes from. They had a hit list of future targets. The title actually comes from it's a quote of Gauri's, "I am on the hit list." This is something that she would say when it became clear that there was these lists of people who were targeted. She made a joke of it. She would say, "I am on the hit list." She and her activist friends kind of made a parlor game out of guessing who was going to be next with a certain kind of gallows humor. She never took the threat seriously, but she did think that she was on these lists, and the lists were real. They actually had literal lists in notebooks of who they intend to kill next. I mean, on top of one of these lists was Girish Karnad, the playwright I was talking about. There were some plans to kill him too, apparently. And they were very clever in a lot of the ways in how they structured their organization. It made it really difficult for the police. The members of the organization barely knew each other. In fact, they'd gotten to know each other much better in prison together than they ever did before. They didn't know each other's real names. They used code names. They didn't ask about each other's personal lives. But nearly all of them had some kind of connection, often a strong connection, to this group, Sanatan Sanstha. The leaders of the conspiracy were typically more senior members within the group, working on their publications. But all of them who had actual roles in the group quit the group before they started this conspiracy. Precisely to make it more difficult for the police to connect their activities to Sanatan Sanstha.
To kind of give a veneer of plausible deniability, presumably.
Exactly. And they deliberately didn't name their group. The most direct connection was the top editor of Sanatan Sanstha's newspapers. Several, and they have many publications, Sanatan Sanstha. Several of the conspirators said that he was directly giving them instructions and funding. And he, just when the police were starting to make arrests, he suddenly died of, I think, a stroke. And so the police's most direct connection to Sanatan Sanstha was severed at that moment. Really unfortunate timing. Honestly, I still don't understand why. I mean, the evidence seems incredibly clear to me. I'm not a cop, but it seems extremely direct. It's baffling to me. This is one of the outstanding mysteries of the case in my mind. Why Sanatan Sanstha has not been directly implicated. Why the guru remains untouched. Part of the charge sheet is an entire book that the guru wrote that all the conspirators had in their possession, that they were using as kind of a manual for what they were doing. And it is a straight up manual for murder for religious reasons. It is as explicit as you could possibly imagine. There are all these instructions, like when how to choose a target. What are the best circumstances under which to kill them? How should you hold the gun? What should you be thinking while you're firing the gun? And then he goes out of his way to say, like, you might think that this is metaphorical. It's not. I'm literally talking about murdering people, you know?
And this is like the leader of a religious order.
Yeah, and it's in English, and it's just like, this is a book that they published publicly. And they kind of took it out of circulation after they started getting a lot of attention, but the entire book is in the chart sheet. I just can't imagine anything more explicit and direct, but yeah, the guy is just, if anything, Sanatan Sanstha is more prominent now than they ever have been. The Gauri Lankesh case has brought them more fame and notoriety, and now they have a bigger platform, and they're more mainstream and successful than ever before.
And, we've been talking as if, there are these four murders and Gauri was the kind of, fourth of the four. But, since her killing and since, the work on this book was completed, I mean, have they been linked to other crimes like this? I mean, is there a larger group of so-called rationalists, if you want to use that catch-all phrase, who have also been targeted?
Yeah, I mean, the murders have stopped, fortunately. There was a lot of concern about that. As the kind of scope of the conspiracy became clear, it really was frightening that, they've arrested these 17 men, but there are so many other people who've been trained by this group who are still out there. Fortunately, it seems like the prominence of Gauri's case and the success of the investigation has disrupted their activities enough to bring them to a stop, at least for now. And I really don't think that they expected Gauri's case to be so notorious, because the three previous murders, each of those writers was locally well known, but none of them blew up even to huge national attention, let alone international attention. I think they thought that Gauri's murder would be along the same lines, that she was this local figure who would be locally mourned, and send a message on a local level. But it became this international thing. I mean, there were stories in all the big newspapers that I saw, all over the world after she was killed. So I think it was a little more than they bargained for. And it was also pretty disruptive to their activities that it got so much attention.
Well, Rollo, I mean, I guess this kind of, is a natural segue to kind of where I thought we could sort of close this conversation, which is, about her legacy and the larger lessons. I mean, we're recording this episode on January 29th, which I believe is the day that her birthday. I think she was born on this day in 1962, if I'm not mistaken.
Absolutely. It's her birthday.
So it's a pretty remarkable day to be doing this with you. That was not planned, by the way. Totally coincident. As you reflect on her life and her untimely death, what is her legacy? And what, I guess, what does her murder say or tell us about the state of contemporary India and its democracy, right? Because, the subtitle of the book is A Journalist's Murder and the Rise of Autocracy in India. So clearly you see these two things as very intimately connected.
Yeah, absolutely. And so many of the people who are closest to her see it the same way. That was one of the main inspirations to me for writing the book, was that among all the other things we discussed, I saw her murder as a clear way to explore what's happening in India politically now. She certainly saw the connection. Her newspaper was almost single-mindedly devoted to what the Modi administration has done to India and how it's changed the character of the country. And Modi was just elected to a third term. He's been in for almost a decade. Here in the U.S., we just got Trump back, which seems almost like, it seems like in retrospect, the way that played out is almost like the worst case scenario, that he had 4 years off to kind of gather his forces and get his act together, and now he's back. I think probably in worse form than he would have been 4 years ago. And so she definitely saw these phenomena as linked. This rise of the right wing and the autocratic impulse worldwide. Obviously, they're all sharing notes. Modi is delighted by Trump's election. And in both places, in both India and the US, we're experiencing this kind of burnout in response. I mean, everyone's noted how the opposition response to Trump's second term is much more muted and disorganized than in the first one, partly because I think there's this feeling that everything that was tried the first time around didn't work. So what's the point in trying that same stuff again? But then it's difficult to find alternatives. At the same time, it feels outrageous not to be responding forcefully and to what we've been seeing unfold over the past week. And there's this quote of Gauri's that circulated a lot. This to me really stood out to me as one of her legacies. 3 years after she died, or 2.5 years after she died, there was an enormous protest movement in India against these new citizenship laws that seemed to many people clearly designed to ultimately strip many, many Muslims of their citizenship. And at that time, it was the biggest protest movement in Indian history, which is something to say. And I noticed that in those months when the protest was at its peak, there was a quote from Gauri that circulated a lot on social media. And she said, "I will do what I can and I will say what I should. These intolerant voices find strength in our silence. Let them learn to argue using words instead of threats." And to me, partly has been one of the big lessons for me from this book is speaking honestly about what's going on. I'm never someone who's been very comfortable with speaking publicly about my political attitudes. And certainly as a journalist, I've often felt like I shouldn't. And Gauri's example, it really changed my thinking on that in a lot of ways, that this idea of being a neutral journalist is a false option, that neutrality itself is a political position in favor of the status quo. And I'm not in favor of the status quo, and I don't want to pretend that I am, and she didn't want to pretend that she was either anymore. So there's this, she had this emphasis, not even just emphasis, she had this irrepressibility. She had this inability to not speak out, She always said what she thought. It came extremely naturally to her. And in a lot of ways, that's her lesson and her legacy, to speak out. It's a tough legacy to grapple with, though. She got killed, There are consequences to speaking out. And I think all of us in India, in the US, and everywhere else where this is happening, this is the dilemma that we're all faced with right now, of the kind of unacceptability, the intolerability of not speaking out, but then the fear that it's completely ineffectual anyway, and that there are really damaging consequences to doing so.
My guest on the show this week is the journalist Rollo Romig. His new book is called I Am on the Hit List, A Journalist Murder and the Rise of Autocracy in India. It recounts the extraordinary life and the untimely death of the journalist activist Gauri Lankesh. Suketu Mehta, who is the author of Maximum City, arguably one of the best books ever written about contemporary India, has this to say about the book. If you want to understand the grave threat to democracy in present-day India, and South India in particular, you could do no better than to read Rollo Romig's gripping book of reportage. It's a murder mystery, travel log, deeply felt homage to Romig's adopted country. Reading it will inform you, outrage you. It will also make you crave a dosa, he ends with. And I should just say, for those who haven't read Rollo, there you should read his entire back catalog, which you can on his website. But one of the most famous pieces that he's written was a piece titled Masala Dosa to Die For, which was published in the New York Times Magazine, which is about the life, a very troubling life of one Mr. Rajagopal, I believe, who was the founder and owner of the tremendously successful South Indian restaurant chain Sarvana Bhavan, and also a convicted murderer, which are two things that normally don't go together in one's head. But Rollo, this was really a phenomenal book. I never met Gauri Lankesh. I know many people who knew her very well. Met some members of her extended family, but you really bring her to life in this book. There is a law and order kind of police procedural element to this book, but it's really much more than that. It's about Southern politics. It's about Lingayat politics in the state of Karnataka. It's about where India is headed, and it's about Bangalore, which I think many of our listeners, particularly those who have spent any time there, will really appreciate. Thanks so much for taking the time.
Thank you so much. It was really a pleasure to be here.
Grantamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindutva Times. This podcast is an HT Smartcast original and is available on htsmartcast.com. You can also find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to rate and review. It helps others find the show more easily. For more information about the show, to support the work we do on Grantamasha, and to find the writing we mentioned on this week's episode, visit our website, grantamasha.com. Tim Martin is our audio engineer. Mira Verghese is our executive producer. Additional assistance is provided by Annabelle Richter. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.
This was a Hindustan Times production brought to you by HT Smartcast.
HT Smartcast.